We're going to begin drawing this face by making a very, very faint egg shape just to place the image on the paper. If you're working next to a monitor, it's a good idea to try to make this about the same size as the image appears on your monitor. That's called working sight-sized. So if you imagine carrying this across, you can see it's about at the top of the head. If I carried that across, it's about at the bottom of the chin. If you do it that way, you're going to get more accurate results because you can pick up all of your landmarks the same way. You carry across, this is about where the nose is. Eye level is about here. And that's one of the huge advantages of working at an easel, where you can see your work right next to whatever's in your field of vision. And if you work sight-size, even if what's in your field of vision is farther away, it still works. You're just going to be drawing it a little smaller. For example, when I go to life drawing and I want to draw the figure sight-size, I will usually bring a piece of paper that's the same size as you're working on now, about 12 by 18, because I can fit the whole figure on if I'm halfway across the room. So notice that our eye line ends up being about in the middle of the head, and the nose line ends up being about halfway between, if I mark where the eyebrows are going to be, that plane change, the bottom of the nose ends up being about halfway between the eyebrows and the bottom of the chin, and the mouth line ends up being about a third of the way down between the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the chin. And before I really start drawing anything, all I'm doing is sort of accounting for these basic proportions, which incidentally are all in the rubric, so these are the things you really have to get right, so take your time at this stage. Before I go into detail, though, I'm going to show you a slightly different approach for this drawing. Before we start drawing the features in any detail, we are going to try to do a very quick shadow map of the entire thing. So, see what I'm doing? I'm just sort of finding that shadow under the nose. I'm looping it around to the left edge of the philtrum. Just try to keep up with me here. Here's the shadow of the upper lip. And that cuts across the bottom lip like this. This is kind of a new way of thinking for most of you. It's sort of putting together several of the things you've learned this semester. Facial structure and shadow mapping with a little bit of perspective. And the way I'm thinking to myself is, well, see, this shadow ends about the same place, as far over to the right as this shadow and this shadow and this shadow. And I'm just thinking about drawing abstract shapes more than I'm thinking about drawing a head at this point. Which is in some ways harder and in some ways easier. It can be, most of the errors to which beginners are prone are errors that involve having a pre-existing idea of the way something should look and then following that idea. And if you think of these as abstract shapes, you could kind of overcome that tendency. Because you're just thinking of these it's as if you were copying a map of South America, assuming you're not too familiar with where the borders between the countries are, and just thinking of them as shapes. And you can see, since probably few of you have a very clear idea in your head right now what the shape of Bolivia is, when you draw it, you're probably going to do a better job than you might do of trying to draw a nose, because you do have an idea of what noses look like, and you're going to try to make your drawing conform to that idea, even if that idea is wrong. Whereas if you're drawing Bolivia, since you don't have much idea what it looks like, you're just sort of copying the contours. Notice I'm coming out kind of far right here. Actually, this is not really part of the shadow map, so I can do that later. The shadow map actually ends here and here. And what I still have to do is, so that's the main shadow. What I still have to do, though, is get in there and do a few smaller shadow shapes. Here's one around the eye. Another one around the eye on that side. And we'll get into the more of the structural details of that in a minute. And that's all the shadows. So before we go into detail, what we're going to do now is a first shading. And remember, I'm shading left-handed. If you're right-handed, which is most of you, you're going to go the other way. And we're just going to try to lay in a tone. And that's going to do something important for us, which is it is going to trick our brains into believing that we are looking at a three-dimensional solid. And the reason I like to do that before the details sometimes is because it's easier to assess the way in which a three-dimensional solid might be slightly off than it is to assess the way a line drawing might be slightly flawed. If once the tone is here and you start to see this as a solid, then your brain starts to give you better information about what might be wrong about it, if that makes any sense at all. Because your brain starts to interpret this not as abstract lines, but as a form. So your brain's going to tell you, oh, the eyes are too close together, or the form's not symmetrical. You're going to start getting a lot of good information like that you would not get otherwise. And this is a stage where now, having done a first shading, I will try to adjust and push and pull the shadow map around until it more closely looks like the pattern of light and dark that I see in the original drawing. I mean the original photograph. This, by the way, it's called a planar head. An artist has sculpted a head in such a way to emphasize the plane changes, which you'll remember from the beginning of the semester. We talked a lot about plane changes. And although most beginners think of the head just as a big ball, which is it more or less is, it's useful to learn to think of it as a series of interlocking planes. And doing studies of these planar head sculptures is very helpful for learning to see it that way. For now, it's very important not to touch any of what are called the halftones. So you've already noticed, like, there's a little darkening right through here and through here. I'm not doing any shading there. That's the last thing I'm going to do, because I want to just shade right now where the light does not reach in the actual shadow shapes. So I'm going to give you just a minute to catch up, and all I'm going to do is I'm just adding some slight shadow accents. Actually, I think at this stage I'm going to pause recording so I can come out and just take a quick look at how things are going. Okay, now we're going to get into a little more of a detail level. And let's start with the eyes. So this is where the form is very subtle because the form is entirely in shadow. So we only see the form based on where the shadow gets slightly darker. But we still can think about things like the eye shape. And a subtle thing that's worth trying to do is when I'm making a shadow like under the eyelid here, instead of shading with the direction of the form, I'm going to shade across it like that. You see what I'm doing? Because I want the form to look a little bit soft. And that's not something that comes naturally to most people. You have to sort of learn to do that. But because all these forms are slightly rounded and softened, it's going to look more natural to shade across the edges. Even across this edge, you see the difference between doing this with your pencil and doing this? And I can see there's a little darkening in the corner of the eye right here, and a little darkening past the eyelid out here. But the normal, what people want to do when they see a shadow shape like this, let me just show you what not to do. Most people just want to color it in like the same direction that the shadow shape moves, like this. You see the difference? And when you do it like this, you end up, all your edges end up being too sharp. But if you shade across the form like that, they end up being naturally soft, and that's what we're going for here. So we're going to come down to the nose, and this is really subtle, but see how this side plane of the nose is slightly darker than the surrounding area? And the tip of the nose is slightly darker even than the side. But here's the important feature that's really going to make or break your drawing. I'm going to go kind of dark on the tip of the nose, and then I'm going to go kind of dark on the cast shadow under the nose, and I'm going to leave a little bit of light in between. You see that? I didn't erase that. That just popped out as soon as I made the cast shadow darker and the form shadow darker. And that reflected light is the indispensable feature if you want to make the nose look like it's coming out from the face. Where this plane changes at the outside of the nostril, it gets a little bit, there's a little reverse highlight in there. You see that? Planes that face the light can either be either peaks or valleys, and this is a little valley that's catching light, and it's important to show that plane change that way. So I just noticed on my drawing, I'm just sort of need to make this a little more vertical, so I'm just going to pull this shadow a little closer to the center right there. And on the mouth, we just have a very, very slight darkening for the upper lip on the shadow side. Hardly any. And this is all very flat. Like, I don't want to see anybody go in here and outline this lip, because you can't, I think I'm zoomed in. Okay. See this? There's really there's no plane change visible here. We may know there's a plane change there, but we can't see it in the photo, so we're not going to draw it. A great drawing is it's just important to leave things out as to put them in. Now, the thing that's going on in the mouth that's going to make your drawing look amazing is exactly like what's happening in the nose. We have a little bit of darkening of the upper lip, form shadow, but not all the way to the line. And then we have another darkening at the line between the lips. And notice that the dark accent is not above that line but below it, because this is a cast shadow. The lip is casting, the upper lip is casting a shadow onto the bottom lip. So we're going to go dark through here and a little bit dark through this core shadow. And you can see that little bit of reflected light in between, which is what makes that upper lip look like it's rolling inward. And when we come down towards the chin, even here we see a little darkening along the bottom edge, but not all the way down. There's actually a subtle reflected light under the chin, and then we darken the neck down below it like that. And it's this little bit of reflected light in between that creates the illumination of the underside of the chin. And we're gonna just stay with me. You'll have some time to perfect your drawing at the end, but I'm just going to talk you through all the main elements. I want to perfect this shadow shape a little bit. And what I want to have is a sense of that light on the eyelid. So I might need to actually erase a little bit here. Notice that the eyelid is casting a shadow onto the eyeball. I'll always remember the day a teacher taught me that the eyelid casts a shadow onto the eyeball. It blew my mind, and I was like 24 years old. Nobody had ever taught me anything. And I had never drawn a cast. And all the artists in the olden days would train by drawing casts, and it was like, it's so obvious when you're seeing a sculpture of a person that the lid casts a shadow onto the eyeball. But on the living person, you get so distracted by the pupil and the iris and the shininess of everything, and you totally miss that important fact that I know I've talked to some of you in your self-portraits about it, but the lid sticks out past the eyeball and casts a shadow. Okay, we're going to take another look. Again, you'll have time to go back and do some more work on that in a minute if you want. But we're going to take another look at some of the big forms Notice that there's a slight darkening right through here, the side plane of the face, into the cheekbone. And I had kind of sketched that before, but I was not committed to it. Now I'm sort of committing a little more. And one thing on the rubric is going to be where you turn your jaw. Notice that we turn the jaw down past the corner of the mouth. And then I'm going to start committing to this shape of the hair, which is very kind of abstracted hair. Sticks out past the cheekbone quite a ways. And I'm finding I just need to elevate the top of my head a little tiny bit here. One thing that you learn to appreciate when you spend a lot of time in museums is that a lot of when you get up close to a painting, you can see where the artist changed his or her mind about something and made a pretty major correction, usually to correct drawing mistakes. And we can see it because oil paint has a weird property of becoming more transparent as it ages. So after a few hundred years, think of it as like whiteout. You know, you cover up a mistake with other paint. After a few hundred years, that paint becomes more transparent, and now you can see the correction. You can see the words coming through underneath. And when you see that, you realize even some really, really great masters would have to correct and edit their work, which is important to recognize, because a lot of us, we're very attracted to the idea of just turning our brains off and just going for it. So what a lot of artists do is they'll just draw everything in, and then they'll just like turn their brains off and just start going for it with shading and color and paint, and they won't make any drawing corrections. But you're going to do much better work if you stay open to the need for corrections. It's not a coloring book. Just because you made some lines, it doesn't mean they're all where they need to be. And it's not a JoJo Siwa coloring book. Thank you, Alex. The wall is obviously gray and the head is white, so the wall is going to be darker than the head. So we can start throwing in some darker darks on the wall. And with a planar head, your task is very simple. What you're looking at is there are some plane changes like this one that are not visible, and you don't have to draw them, and you shouldn't draw them. All the other plane changes are visible for a reason, and that reason is going to be that there's one value on one side and a different value on the other side. We've talked a little bit about values, just how light and dark things are. So what you're going to try to do is figure out which side is darker and press a little harder on that side and don't press as hard on the other side. So on the wall here, I can use it. I can go back to my first shading direction, or I can do vertical shading. That works on the wall because it's a vertical surface. I can even do some horizontal shading. I don't want to start introducing a bunch of curved lines though, because that would just confuse matters. But notice that getting those darks in the wall really helps make the volume more legible as a volume. Sort of makes it pop off the page a little. Oh, here's another correction. I made this contour a little too low. And the more into this you get, the more your drawing, remember the goal is your drawing starts to look like a volume. And when your drawing looks like a volume, you can see ways in which the volume might be a little screwed up. And then you're pushing and pulling darks to make the volume in your drawing look more like the volume that you're able to perceive in the photograph. So I'm going to wrap up this video in a minute and come around and give you some individualized help. I'll give you more time to finish this. I want you to notice, though, that I have not yet drawn a single halftone. All my drawing has been in the shadow side, and I could even I could shade more in the shadow side. See how I can just like pull a tone over this, not smudging it, please, just using that first shading to sort of put veils of tone over the whole shadow side. The last step, though, is the halftones. So what I'm going to do first is clean up my construction lines on the light side of the head. And our goal here is that we never want the halftones to compete with the shadows. Okay, because all the halftones are like so much lighter than any of the shadows. If I zoom in on the photo, you can see what I mean. See this halftone right here at the labial fold? And see this shadow on the other side? To your brain, these might look almost the same value because this has so much dark around it and this has so much light around it. But if we zoom in, you can see that this value here is really close to white. And this value here is much, much darker. Can you see what I'm talking about? You see what happens when we zoom back out? It tricks your brain. A lot of beginners are going to draw this side and this side the same amount of dark. What we're going to do, because we are now experts, is we're going to map this very, very lightly, and then we are just barely touching it. The biggest clue that you're looking at amateur drawing is all these halftones are done way too dark. So you see what I'm doing? I'm just holding my pencil with the lightest possible pressure, and I'm just barely touching these halftones so that nobody confuses them with the actual shadows. And that helps. It makes the drawing look a lot more finished, but only if you use a lot of restraint. You see what I'm doing? Just barely, I'm barely letting any graphite come off the tip of the pencil. And you feel it in your hand, like you were pressing hard on the shadow side, and now you're just barely touching the paper. Okay, I'm gonna leave this up, and I'm gonna stop my video now.